Before we move on to the next session, I just wanted to let you know that we have running tea and coffee on the side of the room, but can I request you to go one by one so that we don't disturb the next session, which is the reporting of the high-level corporate dialogue. And I would once again request Mr. Uwe Brandes to take the stage.
And I would like to invite all of the speakers up at this moment. Come on up. We're competing with tea. Hello again, everyone. My name is Uwe Brandes, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this last panel before we get to the valedictory session. One of the great, wonderful honors that we have being late in the day here is that not only can we talk about new subjects, but we can talk about other subjects that were discussed by previous panels and provide perhaps additional perspective or response to those. And I do think we can all agree that all of the topics that we've been discussing today include great complexity. And so in this panel, we can maybe begin to peel the layers of the onion back and provide additional insight into some of the complexity that we've been discussing already. But without further ado, I'd like to just provide a very straightforward introduction to our panelists. Ms. Kaylee Kreider, Special Advisor for Climate Science, United Nations Foundation, welcome. Mr. Eric Rosten, Sustainability Editor, Bloomberg.com, who of course we just heard from. Ambassador Ajay Malhotra, Distinguished Fellow, TERI. And Mr. Manish Bapta, World Resources Institute, Executive Vice President, Managing Director. And we will be joined in a few moments by Mr. Tarun Kapoor, Joint Secretary, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Government of India. So what I would like the panel to do is to, let's do a first round, a very simple, quick round here. I'd love everyone to introduce themselves a little bit more, talk a little bit about current work that you're engaged in, and share a particular problem that you're working on, perhaps a problem that keeps you up at night. So just to bring this into the present, the contemporary conversation right now. So why don't we just go down the line?
Thank you. In my case, that's a little problematic because I'm not full-time into working with TERI or anything like that. But certainly, let me give it a bit of perspective. I've been involved with these sort of issues for quite some time. I was at the first session of the New and Renewable Energy, the summit held in Nairobi in 1981 or 2, I forget even the year now. And I was at 1992, helped negotiate the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration, etc. A long break doing regular diplomacy, but where also all these things inevitably come in. And I wanted to give one insight, taking on what you mentioned when we were talking I caught the end of that last panel where you were talking about the MDGs and the SDGs. Now, one important difference, the MDGs were not negotiated. They were drafted by the UN Secretariat and put in front of the leadership, who had a choice of accepting them or not accepting them. And as a result, you could set the standard not through a negotiating process, but by UN staff. In the sense that now the SDGs, and I noticed those references to negotiations, which are how normally these things happen. The intention now and what has been achieved, you try and set the bar not to be so low as to be meaningless, and not to be so high as to be unachievable except by a few countries. So in India's case, the MDGs, that's what we had. We do have a lot of poverty, there's no getting away from that. And therefore, on some of those goals, we didn't get there. But that's maybe not due to lack of trying, maybe not having enough wherewithal, maybe lack of good and solid leadership also. I'm not excluding that. But just trying to explain what that was about. And in terms of involvement now, I'm looking at the Paris conference, what comes after that. I think that's perhaps even more important, because Paris is not a full stop. And whether you do reach a useful solution or not, the real action starts after Paris, and we must remember that. So this is a process which will continue. Quite clearly, you have to go in for new non-conventional sources, etc., of energy, etc. And you have to move away as quickly as you can from the more polluting ones. And equally, I think the point that Dr. Ramanathan made, that it's not only CO2 that's causing the problem, and all our attention at Paris is really focused on emissions, CO2, etc., and we need to think beyond that. And as the science gets better at understanding it, trying to find solutions beyond that. Because I've seen it for a long time, how sometimes oceans are sinks, forests and what they can do, pristine forests, and all of that keeps changing. The whole discussion keeps going up and down. So maybe there's something to think and learn from all of that as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you. So I write a lot about climate and energy, and I used to think I covered so many things at Time Magazine that I just covered like terrestrial phenomena, and then they started giving me NASA stories, so I covered terrestrial and extraterrestrial phenomena. So just to give a sense of my background, I think that one thing I've been returning to is Jeffrey Sachs, the economist at Columbia, who's been very involved in the development of the SDGs, and I think his career you can look at as a very good index of just how the world has changed and the nature of our problems has changed. Because you look at Jeffrey Sachs in the late 80s and early 90s was basically going to Bolivia and Poland and Russia and talking to elected leaders and telling them what to do, and they were empowered to hit buttons and make changes, for better, for worse. And that shock therapy you could never do that today, because look at what he's doing today. He's trying to help, this, I don't know what you call this, is the greatest voluntary collaborative effort to fix everything there's ever been. We no longer live in a shock therapy world. And that, I think, is at the root of how difficult everything is.
That's a difficult act to follow, Eric. I've been working on climate change. I actually first began attending the negotiations at COP2. So the Berlin Mandate was my introduction to the climate talks.
The Berlin Mandate, we're going to turn these all into spy novels.
That's right.
Copenhagen Consensus.
And I've been involved in various incarnations, and most recently worked with Vice President Gore for 7 years, so I like to call myself an adult survivor of Vice President Gore, because he works 24/7, including Christmas, I can confirm. But of the things that keep me up at night, I have a couple. The first, I think, is the challenge that we're facing as the Bretton Woods institutions set up after World War II are aging. And I think in some senses they aren't aging well. And I think in the earlier panels we've heard this touched upon, that there are challenges to the model. We heard about the challenge to the Green Revolution model, whether or not there's enough finance available in terms of government ODA assistance, straight government assistance. But there are other challenges too. We look at how we choose the World Bank president and the frustrations that I think people around the world feel about that. The composition of the Security Council. We are in some ways locked into older ideas of governance. Some of them are generational. Some of them, I think, do come out of past conflict. And I think that what they've kept us from being able to do is to truly tap the potential for corporate involvement, for market solutions, for engagement of civil society, and for subnational solutions. You can see we're trying to begin to tap those, and we have a pillar as part of the Paris Agreement that's trying to figure out ways to measure these things. And I actually remember when the World Resources Institute first actually came up with some of the ways that companies could start to measure their greenhouse gas emissions. I was around for that. But really, I think that we're still in some ways trapped in some old thinking, and you can see the reaction to it by the creation of the Asian Development Bank and others. And I think that this is one of the things that is a real challenge for our time, and one that we need to take up. I think the second that I see is that in particular democratic governments are having difficulties with foresight planning. You can see this now. Time magazine did a short feature that looked at the top 5 global stories for 2015, and climate change was not one of them. That's, to me, not a shock, because I think the mainstream media still has real difficulty in sort of covering climate change per se. But every single one of the 5 problems that did make it on there was a foresight planning problem. Migration, Syria, Ukraine. We know when oil prices fall that governments that rely on oil go into crisis. We've known this historically, and yet we have very difficult time planning around it. So I just think we're having real difficulties engaging in real foresight planning, and that's going to be a true issue with climate change, because we know it's going to lead to more issues of migration. We know it's going to lead to a range of planning issues that as yet we haven't become that good at. And I guess the last just piece of this I'll say is I don't think yet, when I first started working on climate change, we still had the era, the sort of last of the folks that negotiated things in the back of a napkin, created countries, on the basis of a napkin in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere. And I still don't know that we have seen the first of the true multilateralists that are prepared, rather than having an Asian Development Bank and a World Bank that are truly prepared to deal with true multilateralism in sort of what I would call for lack of a better word, the sort of post-Cold War era. When I first started working on these issues, it was, the US and their bloc and the G77 in China. And we haven't really developed the language and the structures to really begin the true type of multilateral engagement that we need.
Great.
Team
So Manish Bapna, I'm relatively actually new to the climate conversation. My background's in rural poverty. I worked on water, forest, watershed type stuff with the World Bank for quite a long time. I'm with the World Resources Institute now. We've been around for about 35 years, a global research organization focused on kind of energy, climate, forests, water, food, and cities. We established a presence in India about 7 years ago. We now have about 75 people in India, the vast majority actually working on cities. and then quite a bit on energy and forests. But it's quite interesting that the niche that we found in India is actually not to look at climate directly, but to recognize a more immediate problem of urbanization and how to respond to that, which, if done properly, actually has major climate co-benefits. So it's kind of looking at more of a development-first narrative in terms of our work in India, but that has important climate sustainability kind of co-benefits. I should say to Eric, I've known also, I feel bad, I've never said this on a panel before, but I failed out of 2 classes from Jeff Sachs back in graduate school. But at the time, I feel proud about that in light of your description of his evolution. So, but you know the other small thing that we've done that actually is probably quite relevant to this topic is we set. So when C.K. Prahalad was alive, Jamshed Godrej, World Resources Institute, set up a track 2 dialogue between the United States and India. That's been going around for 5-6 years. It was set up in the run-up to Copenhagen when there was still prospects of legislation in the United States and a real desire to see how can we make sure we have a good bilateral and multilateral engagement on climate because it was important in the US for it to be seen that India was doing something and vice versa. That, obviously, with the Copenhagen not having the outcome that perhaps people expected beforehand, you know, that dialogue has I think, generated some interesting new areas of work. John Podesta used to chair it on the US side, now Carol Browner does, Jamshed Godrej does on the India side. But I just raised that because the topic is specifically around energy. And we've had, I think, some very good work around HFCs, around trade disputes, around pace and how to think about energy between the 2 countries moving forward, as well as what happens in the international climate negotiations. So the thing that keeps me up is actually when one takes a step back and looks at whether it's the climate conversation or the SDGs, that in the short term, what we need to do, I think a lot of people can make a good economic argument that what we need to do makes good economic sense. If one looks at kind of, you know, building up renewables, if one looks at kind of building smart cities, if one looks at keeping forest cover, these are steps that are typically good for growth, they're good for development, and they also have good climate co-benefits. The question is how to deal with some of there's still lots of issues, but the basic economics makes good sense. But we also know that where we need to be in a short 15, 20 years is actually a transformation. We need to see a pretty rapid transformation. So it's not the next 5 or 10 years and the low-hanging fruit. It's kind of how do we set the conditions for the transformation we need to see. And that's a much more difficult argument to make in terms of the economics, the financing, the partnerships that are needed to help seed that long-term transformation we need to see. If we need to be at a place where we have truly zero net carbon in 35 years, what do we need to do now to get that type of transformation? So that's on my mind.
That's fantastic. That's exactly the transition that I was looking for. And I want to build on a couple of these themes and then ask a second question around interdisciplinary approaches. Given that we are in a long-term effort, none of the issues that we've discussed today really are new, maybe with the exception of the incredible impact that technology and information technology is having on the conversation. That's maybe one thing that I would characterize as new. But given that some of the trends that are really driving the economic transformation in India, particularly the issue of urbanization that we have known about for so long, these long-term trends and the issues and challenges of governance really raise a very big question for the energy dialogue, and that is, how is it being approached on an interdisciplinary co-benefits basis? We heard the first presentation this afternoon from Professor Ramanathan. I mean, what a fantastic vision for these campuses in California to really establish this goal for themselves that appears to be exceedingly achievable. but how, from an energy dialogue perspective, which we're here to discuss here today, how do you see new frameworks of interdisciplinary approaches and new frameworks of co-benefits actually being implemented or actually being proposed? Let's just go down the line. And we'd
Thank
like
you.
to, of course, welcome Mr. Kapoor to our
Thank you. I think you've raised a point that deserves a comment, certainly a serious one. Talking about urbanization, this is a huge issue, and as was correctly pointed out by another speaker, for us, the threats of urbanization in a situation where our cities are already severely stressed, and you cannot get away from that, and the increasing flow of population from rural to urban areas is adding to the issue, and climate change will worsen all of that. So this is a hugely important thing. Our Prime Minister's tried to address that by bringing in this concept of cities, which, as he has called them, smart cities, and you mentioned bringing in IT into play. This is absolutely the right way to go, but not good enough. We need to add on to that, and as you said, multidisciplinary approach is needed. I would have added to it by calling it what we need are healthy cities, cities which are vibrant, lively, etc. You can have access to IT and its benefits in a smart city, but what good is it if, as in India, somebody says that after 9, everyone has locked themselves up in their flat or their building, is a little concerned about going out because the streets are dark, or the women are worried that, or the parents are worried that the child, maybe a boy or a girl or a youngster, teenager, may or may not come home in time, and therefore they can't sleep waiting for the person to return. So you need to build in all of this. Having smartness is not the only criteria. It is an important one. And I think, for example, architectural design, how are the cities designed? Very important. Is it safe to sit out at 1 in the morning for a girl and to read a magazine under a light in the park? Now that's a healthy city. If I feel like it, I should be able to go down and sit. Not in many countries can you do that. How do you access and move around? Do you go from your home to your working place? Like in Netherlands, for example, now they're increasing stress on use of bicycles. What are we doing about that? Is it metro that you need? How do you need to address all of these things? So these are all important aspects that need to be looked at. So if you say urbanization, how it needs to be tackled, yes, you need to put in more money. We need to use, as India, we need to use our strengths in IT, and on that the Prime Minister's got it exactly right. But we need to make it all interdisciplinary, bring in the benefits of design and architecture and art, and also safety and security and all the other issues. It is not to be left to one or another group to find the right solution in what is a smart city is a healthy city, and the other way around. A healthy city is a smart city, but it has to be healthy besides being smart. Thank you.
Let's go down the line. Mr. Kapoor, would you like to respond to the panel?
So I think interdisciplinarity is just the way everything works now for a couple of reasons. I mean, there were two. The main one is internet technology is it's fun and it's useful, but I think what we're seeing now, just the very tip of, is all our institutions, all of them, are structured based on how people are able to talk to each other. And so since we can talk to each other differently, all of our institutions are suboptimal or wrong. And so that's, I think, driving a lot of it is is that the ability to get out of your silo. The other is just the increasing complexity of every topic there is, and no one is smart enough to have the expertise to even understand all these things we're talking about today. I think my favorite sort of index of this is how business and environmentalists and government in the US are all sort of switching hats. Like the head of the World Wildlife Fund in the US sort of resuscitated the brand of Pringles potato chips before going into the civil society sector. Environmental groups in general are sort of behaving more like management consultants. Management consultants are pioneering some of the most important environmental work we're seeing. You have people like Paul Pullman, who is the head of a public company, but you would think was Secretary General of the United Nations. Like everyone is switching hats. Everybody needs everybody's help, and all our institutions are in dramatic change. So it's kind of no wonder that it seems like we need more than our traditional disciplinary silos.
I used to have a running joke that we used to have a hard time getting people in the energy space to talk to people in the climate space because someone who had graduated with an engineering degree would never talk to a PhD atmospheric chemist. And it actually has been a real problem in the climate change space. We've seen it in the negotiations where traditionally environment ministers led the negotiations, and that has shifted over time to include the State Departments and then finance ministers. But it has been very interesting because climate lends itself to a very cross-sectoral approach, and yet it has been often siloed into an environmental space. I think the real challenge that we're seeing now also is in the resilience or the adaptation space, where now as we're trying to react to natural disasters, in particular now it's drawing in a range of planners all the way down to the local level, and even in so-called wealthy countries like the United States, where we can't even respond to a forecast hurricane, albeit some of them strong like Katrina, or not as quote-unquote strong like Sandy. If we can't deal with it in the United States, just imagine what it's like somewhere else. But I wanted to touch on something that the ambassador raised, which is that people often are inherently resistant to change. There's a case where Pepsi, which owns a number of brands, tried to introduce a compostable bag for sun chips. And it led to a huge backlash on the internet because the bag had a slightly louder crinkling sound. And people reacted against the sound, and it created a whole meme, and they had to pull the bag off of the market because it was a louder crinkling and louder noise. I was very lucky in my previous job to get to work with Apple. And the one thing that I got to learn from the limited times that I got to be around Steve Jobs and the designers there is the crucial importance of design. People will adapt to new technologies, new brands, new ways of working when there is a focus on design. And this is actually universal. And I think it is something that in the climate and energy space we have utterly failed to consider in a very real way. You're just beginning to see it in the green building space. There has been a backlash against some of the new developments because they were introduced too soon or poorly, or the quality of the light was so poor. But a focus on design, to me, is so crucial as a beginning to uptake to change. And unfortunately, I think we've failed because of many of our academic backgrounds to truly consider the importance to real people of design.
Yeah, and I'm going to pick up on that last point. And so I think the question is a really important one, because all too often we solve one problem and create another. And so taking a step back and understanding how connected different issues are, to a particular intervention is crucially important. And I just want to pick out three very simple things that play out in India, but play out in many countries around the world where we continue to see major disconnects that end up really resulting in suboptimal policy and design. Urban planning and transport, right? So urban planners, transport engineers, they don't talk to each other. So you end up with cities, too many cities that look like Atlanta, and not enough that look like Barcelona, right? What India does there, massively important, right? If India ends up constructing 50 Atlantas, then whoever in the previous panels talked about the coal deposits, that will lock in emissions that the world will have a difficult time pivoting away from. But if urban planners don't talk to transport engineers, you never get the investments in public transit and non-motorized transit that rapidly reduce the necessity for private car ownership. Energy and water. When I was, some of the work that we did these maps of China where we showed water stress at a very granular level today and in the future. We overlaid that with coal deposits and shale gas deposits. We presented that at a panel. We were on CCTV for like the next week. Not that they didn't know, of course, the importance of water scarcity and energy, but just to make that visible and accessible, massively relevant. And same thing in India, where the coal deposits are deeply concentrated, as many of you know, in a particular part of India, where there continues to be, significant water issues. Forest cover and land productivity, right? Forest cover, water regulation, land productivity. The connection and the challenge is that national governments, institutions are typically set up still largely to work in silos and working across institutions as much as there has been efforts to do so for decades. Very difficult to sustain that over time and to create the incentives to do so. Where I think there's more interesting innovation is in cities, is with the private sector, where you might be able to work across those boundaries in a more seamless fashion. And I think that type of institutional innovation is arguably as important as technological innovation or financial innovation to get the sustained, stable policy environment we need and the public investment we need to really crowd in the private investment for long-term solutions.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Kapoor, we've gone through two cycles here. First, just a general introduction, what are you working on? And then secondly, how are you integrating your activities in an interdisciplinary fashion? So the floor is yours.
So you want me to talk about what we are working on?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I look after renewable energy, part of it in India. I look after the National Solar Mission. And the mission has recently been given a target of 100,000 megawatts of grid-connected power by the government, by the Prime Minister, to be achieved by 2022. That's one part. The other part is on off-grid. So on off-grid, we have this major issue of energy access. Energy access is a very, very major issue in India because large number of households are still unconnected, or if they are connected, then they don't get stable power, and both for lighting and then the other basic need is cooking. So cooking also, large populations are still dependent on untreated biomass or very crude, unscientific methods of cooking, very inefficient and not healthy. So these are two major areas for the energy access portion. And we also deal with solar thermal applications, so water heating and industrial applications. Complete solar, all types of uses of solar. While world over, there is a lot of attention on renewables. In India, we've started thinking of renewables in the last 4-5 years in a big way. In wind, India has done well. We already have over 24,000 megawatts installed, and we are 5th in the world. In solar, we just started 4 years ago, so we are at 4,300 megawatts and probably 11th in the world. But with a target of 100 gigawatts, we will have to add around, say, 12 to 15,000 megawatts every year, which is really steep. No country has done that. So if we really want to achieve that, then that becomes a huge task for us. So that will also change the way we look at our grids, the way we manage our grids, the way we manage our entire energy. So that's on one side, that's a big thing for India. On the other side, distributed generation is something new for India. So rooftop is just taking off. It's just like we have only 80 to 90 megawatts installed so far in rooftop grid connected, proper grid connected. On the off-grid side, we have about 400 megawatts, but on the proper grid connected, it's just around 80 to 90 megawatts against 4,300 for the large projects. But one very different thing which India is doing is very ultra mega, very large scale projects. So we are setting up 25 solar parks, total capacity 20,000 megawatts, average size around 700-800 megawatts each. Some very large ones, like one coming up with 2,500 megawatts in one location. Already projects are under construction there. The biggest in the world as of now is in US, which is 540 megawatts. I visited that last Saturday. 2 projects here, those are the biggest. But in 1 year's time, we'll have much bigger than these in India, several of them coming up. So huge activity on the solar side, on the renewable side. And then this thing about smart cities and energy sustenance in cities. So this is another topic, very important, very major in India. Big work required, big action happening. So maybe I think I'll just stop here and then.
That's great. So I'd like to open it up now for comments, and I do want to recognize that we do have members of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and would welcome any comments from that delegation. The mic? Yes. So here, one question in the front.
Hi. This is about corporate dialogue. So I think this is probably appropriate because what we are talking about is now interdisciplinary actions. So could there be a interdisciplinary city? You know, we have green cities, smart city, resilient cities. Just about a week ago, in the same, in Washington, D.C., we had a Smart City Week. So we are actually coordinating 2 smart cities in central India. One is a new capital city, and the other is a regional existing hub. What we see there happening, some of the pork which is going, is a different set of companies. So one is the command center. So it's an urban informatics hub in which the interagencies, if there are water agency, traffic agency, security, police, so there is a command center. Second, which we have, again, the US and the India exchange, we are talking about something called Vision Zero, no accidents. In this whole conference and also these conferences which I see, there's one part which is missing. And that's why, like I say, like when we are talking about the corporate dialogue and governmental and interdisciplinary this thing, 40 to 65% of our city is an informal economy. So they are not on Twitter. There's no way, even though they are running our trains, they are tending to our seniors and, all kind of things they are doing to support themselves and service our city. Still, they are not part of the dialogue. Like across the whole scenario, we really have no place for the informal sector. And when we are talking about the big data and so that's exactly is my question, is how we can get them into the conversation.
Thank you. So I heard 2 questions in there. One was the totality of challenges of working in cities, and then second, of course, one of social equity, one that has been discussed a little bit this morning. But reactions? Is this missing from the conversation? Does the energy, dialogue need to ramp up capacity in these areas? Just high-level reactions.
I think on the first point, cities are inherently interdisciplinary, and I think in a lot of the leading megacities around the world, really, you see cities trying to harness not only their own sort of multitude of professions and expertise to try to make their own cities better. You're seeing the emergence for the first time, probably ever, just because we're able to, of cities reaching out to each other and learning from each other in really aggressive ways. I'm just to cite two examples. Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, head of the company I work for, has been very involved in the C40 initiative, which counterintuitively is a group of 60-plus cities that are trying to learn from each other. The former mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, has been involved in trying to get cities to learn best practices from each other and to sort of ease procurement and all the really boring things that nobody ever wants to talk about but are sort of hold up progress. And I, just to point out sort of the most salient things that are happening now.
I think this is the perfect example of how we have really failed to look at the solutions and what we need to be doing, because I really think what happened on climate change is that we looked at the ozone depletion problem, and humans by their very nature work by analogy. So we thought ozone depletion was quote unquote solved by a treaty. So we're going to apply that lesson for this global transnational problem through a treaty. And unfortunately, there were many pluses to that. Engagement of senior leadership, setting up a multilateral process. Unfortunately, climate change and energy are a very different issue. There are many more sources of the problem. It's not just a couple of chemicals with a couple of manufacturers. And so the analogy really wasn't a great one for this issue. And I would really argue that engagement at the local elected official level is at its very beginning and infancy stages, right? There was the creation of ICLEI, I think back in the late 90s, which really was just adopting the treaty levels at the local level. And then, you know, C40, I mean, think of how many cities there are in the world, and we're up to 60, okay? So to me, it's, I look at this really as a we'll have the largest ever gathering, thanks to Mayor Bloomberg, of mayors in Paris, but it's just scratching the surface. Many of these local elected officials have small staffs. Some of them, like the city I live in, the mayor's wife ended up being the person that led on environmental sustainability because he didn't have the budget to have a large environmental office, so his wife donated her time. We have to understand that local elected officials often don't have the same resources, and really look at how we build out, because while it's great to have some model cities and a few zero carbon cities, we actually need to build this out in a much, much larger way, and this is just the beginning.
That's great. We have gotten the signal to get the hook. So we're going to leave it at that. That was a phenomenal way to end. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause. And secondly, you know, these challenges are really great opportunities. And so I look forward to all of us here at the conference working with TERI on these fantastic opportunities. Thank you very much.